Hi there. I just wanted to make a video because the third week discussion board on price elasticity of demand is the most difficult discussion for most students of the term. Additionally, the price elasticity of demand section of your final paper, which is also on milestone 2, is also the most struggled with topic on that. So I thought a separate video for that would be especially helpful. But I promise, with a little bit of extra time commitment, some helpful resources, it is possible to do well on both of those assignments. So here are my tips to help you do that. The first, and this is something I also talked about in the first discussion, but make sure you read the prompt carefully and are addressing all of the required elements. So for this third week discussion, you are tasked with writing how responsive do you think consumers will be to the price change when these fluctuations occur due to changes in supply. This is regarding gas prices. And you'll have to say why using the various determinants of elasticity to explain your answer. So we're going to talk about what those are a little bit later, but you want to make sure to do that. You also need to talk about how does the price elasticity of demand for gasoline impact the effectiveness of taxes on gasoline aimed at correcting a negative externality. We're going to talk more about what that means. This is by far the more missed portion of this question, so it's important that we go over that. And then also for an exemplary score, it says consider incorporating the supply and demand model to demonstrate the elasticity of demand for gas and to show the effects of a tax on the market for gas. So this actually means either drawing a graph, finding a graph, or just really explaining the supply and demand model in detail, what occurs in this scenario. So you'll want to be sure to do that. And also read the prompt to make sure your peer responses are meeting the requirements as well, which for the peer responses, you'll need to describe in detail how your own actions reflect ideas shared by your peers and relate that to the concept of elasticity. So don't just say, yeah, I still have to drive to work when gas prices go up. That's not an exemplary response. You'll want to talk about why you also do that and relate that to the concept of elasticity. So, as usual, you want to make sure you're understanding the terminology and not making some common mistakes by utilizing some available resources. So, before you write your post, you want to make sure that you use section 5.3 video in my econ lab, as well as that you've taken a look at the section 6.2 video. Make sure you understand the definition of price elasticity of demand. Don't change any words. We're not talking about price flexibility. We're not talking about cross elasticity. We're not talking about elasticity of supply. Right here for this discussion, we are talking about price elasticity of demand, which is the responsiveness of the quantity demanded to a change in price. How we measure that is we divide the percentage change in the quantity demanded by the percentage change in price. And why we do that, the calculation here you won't have to do in the discussion. There will be some on the homework problems, but you need to understand why that's how it's calculated, to understand what it means. And basically, we're saying if we change the price, is the quantity changing by a lot compared to that price change or by a little? So if the value is greater than 1, which means the quantity is changing by more than the price in terms of a percentage. So that means people are really responsive, which translates to elastic demand. Whereas if the price elasticity of demand is less than 1, that means the quantity is changing by a smaller percentage than the price, meaning, okay, the price went up, but people haven't changed their behavior that much. That's inelastic. And also, if you don't remember back from your math days, the absolute value just means we take the negative number and make it positive. So the demand curve is downward sloping. Anytime you do this calculation, you're going to get a negative number, but the absolute value just means we take off that negative sign. So is it greater than 1 or is it less than 1? So less than 1 means between 0 and 1. It doesn't mean negative 3.2, because when you take the absolute value of that, that's actually elastic because it's greater than 1. So I hope that makes sense. The other thing here, a common mistake on the discussion is a lot of people say, well, yeah, consumers are really responsive to price changes because, they complain a lot about it, they cut other things out of their budget. And that's not what we mean by responsive. We mean, do they actually buy less gas than before? And if so, is it by a bigger percentage change than the price increase or not? So we want to know if it's elastic or inelastic, not how much people complain about it, or if they're spending less on other things because gas prices have gone up. So when we're talking about price elasticity of demand, and you'll have to do this in your paper as well, but there are 5 determinants that are on pages 178 and 179 of your text. You want to make sure you are mentioning these in your discussion board post. And that is the availability of close substitutes, meaning the more substitutes there tend to be for a good, the more elastic the demand tends to be. If there are not good substitutes for a product, it tends to be inelastic. So these are all guidelines. Just because one says the demand might be elastic and another says inelastic, that's why we want to look at several of these. And on your paper, you'll want to look at all 5. So just to get a good overall picture, it's not a rule, but these are guidelines for how we can get a feel of whether a product would be elastic or inelastic. So the passage of time means basically how much time do you have to make a decision. With gas, how much time do you have? Is your car empty or is it not? But with the passage of time, basically, if you have more time to think about a decision, the demand tends to be more elastic, versus if you have less time, it tends to be inelastic. Luxuries versus necessities. So here you'll want to think about whether gas is a luxury or a necessity. As a general rule, luxuries tend to be more elastic goods, whereas necessities tend to be more inelastic. Definition of the market is the next one, and that what you're really going to do is talk about, okay, well, is the gas at the Shell station on this corner more elastic than just the demand for gas in general? So the more specifically you define a market, the more elastic it tends to be, is the general rule there. And then the share of a good in a consumer's budget. So if a good takes up a really big portion of the budget, you really have to think about it. And so it tends to be more elastic. If it's a smaller part of the budget, it tends to be inelastic. For example, when you're thinking of a good like table salt, if the price of table salt goes up by 10%, you probably wouldn't even notice, right? Because table salt is not very expensive. Whereas if the price of a TV went up 10%, you'd take more notice to that because it's a bigger change. So those are the 5 determinants of price elasticity of demand that can help you just determine how responsive consumers are in situations where you can't actually calculate the mathematical value. However, in terms of gasoline, if you go ahead and flip to table 6.2 on page 180 of your text, it tells you, it actually has an estimate for the price elasticity of demand. So when you're reaching your conclusion on whether gas is elastic or inelastic based on these determinants, you can flip there and check your answer, right? You'll be able to know what that is, and that should help point you in the right direction as you're writing this post. Now moving on to the second part of the prompt, it is the most difficult. It's a lot of people just kind of get lost in the concept of externalities, and they do a nice job talking about that, but they don't relate it all the way through back to elasticity. So you do need to know what a negative externality is, and that's a cost that affects someone who is not directly involved in the production or consumption of a good or service. So basically, when I go and fill my car up with gas and I drive around, I cause pollution, right? Pollution is the negative externality. And that's important to know, but what you're really needing to understand here, the main takeaway, and you need to be able to communicate this, is whether a tax would be more effective at reducing the consumption of a good with elastic demand or inelastic demand. And then you'll tie that to whether you think the demand for gas is elastic or inelastic, and just relate those two things together. And for your model, in terms of putting this to the model, we talked about for an exemplary, you'll need to talk about the supply and demand model. On page 147 of your text, there is a similar scenario that shows a tax for electricity. And electricity and gas have a lot of similar characteristics. So that's a really great example for you to look at for this problem to see what might happen. So not only say what is happening to your curves, supply and demand curves due to a tax, you'll want to say how the model tells consumption would change, and just how elasticity of demand matters. Is consumption changing a lot or a little based on the elasticity of demand for gas? So you want to make sure you do all that. Some more resources to help you are the YouTube video, just how much do consumers react to price changes. There is, usually I say don't use blogs for this course because there's a lot of information out there that's just incorrect and people can put whatever they want on a blog. But this one I do happen to think is really great in terms of understanding elasticity of demand. And also I recommend the Khan Academy. In general, it has a lot of great information on other topics we'll cover in here too, but there's some good videos on price elasticity of demand, and the most applicable one to the discussion is linked down here. And the PowerPoint is attached to this announcement, so you can have all the links. And then I just wanted to review some other reminders that I mentioned in the video on the first discussion, which is to understand how you'll be evaluated. Take a look at the undergrad discussion board grading rubric, just to make sure when you're writing your posts, you're thinking about how I have to grade you on them. And remember, again, full credit, your post has to be in by Thursday with your 2 peer responses in by Sunday. No late work is allowed for any reason. So at the end of Sunday, if you haven't gotten anything in, it's too late. But if you still have questions on price elasticity of demand, you should definitely ask them because you'll need it for your final paper. And also, you want to make sure you're citing all your sources used when writing your posts, preferably in APA format. There's a lot of great resources here that can help you with that. And then just because this discussion is more difficult than the other ones for most people, you're welcome to come back, edit your original post. You can do that by clicking on the arrow in Brightspace. I know we're having some adjustments between Brightspace and Blackboard, but you should get a drop down that allows you to edit. If you can't figure that out, just post another response to the thread and say, oh, I realize this is this, or just anything you want to add or any changes. So make sure you get any changes in by Sunday, and I will have that be reflected in your grade. Also, do not forget to come back and do your 2 peer response posts and proofread. Okay, you are evaluated on writing, so if you make mistakes, I have to deduct for that. So make sure you look everything over carefully. And that's week 3. If you have questions, post them in the general discussion. I'm glad to answer them, and just give it your best shot. And you can understand it. Just keep reviewing the resources and ask any questions you have.